Welcome back to Face the Nation. For a closer look at our CBS News Battleground Tracker poll, we're joined by CBS News Elections and Surveys Director Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, always good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
And you've been very busy as we get closer to these midterms, and you tested a number of very big ideas. What are voters telling you they think's at stake?
Well, the first thing is it gives you a sense of the stakes here in the minds of voters, which they say are really large. And specifically, 68% say their rights and freedoms are potentially at stake in this election. And for context, that's even more than, say, things like their finances and their financial well-being is at stake here. Now, look, there's always in every election, the campaigns will say, this is the most important election ever. Right. So we step back and say, OK, be specific. What do you think will happen were one side or the other to win? And one thing that stands out is people think that if the Republicans take control of Congress, that women by 3-1 will have fewer rights and freedoms than they currently do, then would have more. And some of that is related to views on abortion, which we'll get to in a second. There's also there's other groups that stand out here. For example, LGBTQ folks, voters think will have fewer rights if the Republicans were to win. Now, the other part of this, though, is tied to views on democracy, which a lot of people worry about right now. And that comes out in some of these findings, too.
And this is, elections are central to democracy. So what is it that people see at risk here when you ask that?
So 3/4 of people continue to say they think democracy is under threat. That's number one. And then to your point about elections, we asked people, because there's so much context here, people are still talking about election denialism, still arguing about what happened in 2020. So, OK, what happens if your side loses this time? Republicans, what happens if Democrats win a state or a district, and vice versa? And we found 1/3 of Republicans and half of MAGA Republicans specifically, and then just under 1 in 5 Democrats said their party should be prepared to challenge states and districts that they lose. Now, that's
1/3 of Republicans.
It's 1/3 of Republicans, and it's even higher for MAGA Republicans, yeah.
And the election hasn't happened yet.
And it hasn't happened yet.
But
so
it shows a distrust in the institution itself.
Absolutely. And I think that's really the critical point. If we have this distrust in the process, in the way that we adjudicate our differences here going in before it's even settled, that's part of what's underpinning. People see that and they sort of
That's the whole ball game when it comes to democracy itself. But I know you also, we referenced the fact that when it comes to how close this race could be, it's narrowing here. Republicans have a narrow advantage.
It is. Some of that relates, a lot of that relates for Democrats to the abortion issue. So let me start with that, because it's also very much what the Democrats want this race to be about, in part. Democrats have a growing lead among people who say abortion is the most important issue. And in particular, for women who want abortion to be legal, it's the most important thing. It's more important than inflation. It's more important than the economy. And it's a deal breaker. They have to have that position in a candidate to vote for them. By contrast, let me turn to the Republicans for a second. They continue to have their lead on the economy. It hasn't grown. It's stable. And there's plenty of voters out there who think they're not talking about it enough. But the other thing they kind of want this election to be about is immigration, which we tested in this case. There's a big part of the Republican base, almost 9 in 10, 87%, who like the idea of moving migrants from border areas into Democratic-leaning areas.
Wow.
Why is that important with the base? Well, to the extent that this is a turnout election, it's important to motivate your base. And OK, Republicans really like that. It's much more mixed with the rest of the public. But they specifically like it for one reason, that they think it calls attention to the problem. And to the extent that it's putting that more on the radar, it is for independents, for other Republican voters. And again, back to the idea of what is this election going to be about?
So we're in the final weeks. What's the closing argument?
I think two things. One is you're going to hear a lot of talk about democracy, like we said. One is you're going to see this back and forth of what is this about? It's about abortion, rights, immigration, the economy. But the other part of it is there's half of each party's voters about that see the other side, not as political opposition, but as enemies. And it's a little bit sobering to see that. But you have to, out from that, think, well, what happens if you view the other side as somebody you can't work with? That's a threat to your way of life. In some ways, it justifies any action. It justifies things that you might say or do that you wouldn't otherwise if you still believed in the system. And I think that, again, it's difficult to say, and we should emphasize it's not everyone, but oftentimes those folks are the most ideological, they have the loudest voices, and they certainly drive the narrative a lot. And that's very much what you're going to see, because then the parties start to say, well, those people vote. Those people are going to turn out. So if you see the campaigns talking about why the other side is bad, and a lot of voters say that's what the campaigns are mostly talking about, why the other side is bad, that kind of runs counter to what you usually see where campaigns are talking about what can we do for you.
Right, the affirmative argument.
Yeah.
Anthony, some really sobering perspective here. Thank you for all your work on this. Thanks. We'll be right back. Financial markets flashed warning signs last week of growing economic uncertainty. CBS News senior national correspondent Mark Strassman reports from Atlanta.
Inflation stubbornly above 8%. The Dow ending this week below 30,000. Vanished nearly 2 years of gains. Interest rates up 3 points in 6 months. And worse, we're all flying blind here.
No one knows with any certainty where the economy will be a year or more from now.
That uncertainty's now hitting us where we live.
I do like these cabinets.
In America's worsening housing crunch. Over that 2-year feeding frenzy to overpay. Many buyers shudder at mortgage rates above 6%, the highest in 14 years.
What's even more significant is how much sellers are pulling back. If you borrowed money at 3% to buy a house, you're never going to leave.
Another issue, so-called shelter inflation. Surging home prices and rents racing faster than wages.
We're going to be feeling this. It's not just one part of the country, it's almost all parts of the country.
Moody's Analytics says more than half of America's largest regional markets are significantly overvalued by 25% or more. 210 out of 413 markets, many pandemic boom towns. Moody's number one, Boise. Home prices 72% too high. Other overvalued areas, Austin, Charlotte, Las Vegas, and Phoenix.
I expect national house prices nationwide, across all these markets, to probably fall about 10% peak to trough, over the next year or two.
Housing's notoriously cyclical. What goes up must come down. In a recession, expect the law of gravity here to kick in with a vengeance. Moody's predicts home value declines could double. For now, few experts predict a housing crash, a plunge in home values as deep and painful as in the Great Recession. But in much of America, affordable housing's an ongoing crisis. Many experts say that should improve slowly if the Fed can nudge supply and demand into a healthier place and confidence in the economy can find a new home of its own.
The sales volume is going to be low. Prices are going to come down some, but the bottom isn't going to fall out of the market.
That's Mark Strassman reporting from Atlanta, and we turn now to the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, Raphael Bostic. Good morning to you, sir. It's good to have you back. I want to get your perspective. We know stock market is not the economy, but it is a forward-looking indicator, and it's showing some concern right now. Around the world, central banks are trying to get control of inflation. The Fed has already raised rates 5 times this year. Why isn't inflation coming down?
Well, first of all, good morning, Margaret. It's really good to see you. And, inflation is high, it's too high, and we really need to do all that we can to make it come down. And when you think about its source, it's because we have very high demand, we have not enough supply, and as long as you have that gap, prices are going to be feeling upward pressure. So we've got to narrow that gap. And what we were hoping would happen is that we'd see some movement on the supply side to move the supply up so that there wasn't so much of an auction on goods that are in the marketplace. But that hasn't happened, and that really has meant that we have had to turn to our policies to try to take demand down and reduce its level. And I think a lot of what you saw in the lead-in piece here is that demand is starting to shrink, and ultimately that will start to pay dividends when we think about inflation levels.
So these higher interest rates, for businesses, it makes it more expensive for them to get loans. For consumers, it makes them more expensive, as we were talking about, to get mortgages, credit card debt, loans. That's how it sort of cools things off a little bit. we've already had 2 back-to-back quarters of negative GDP growth, which would put us in that category of recession. How significant of a pullback are you expecting here?
Well, first of all, I think that the GDP number is one way to think about the economic performance, but many others would suggest that the economy has a lot of positive momentum. We're still creating lots of jobs on a monthly basis. And so I actually think that there is some ability for the economy to absorb our actions and slow in a relatively orderly way. Look, we need to have slowdown. There's no question about that. But I do think that we're going to do all that we can at the Federal Reserve to avoid deep, deep pain. And I think there are some scenarios where that's likely to happen.
Deep, deep pain, or that you can avoid the deep, deep pain?
Oh, that we can avoid the pain. Thank you for that. Sorry.
Alan Blinder, the former vice chair of the Federal Reserve, wrote a piece in the Journal this week, and he said the chances of a softish landing based on history are well under 50%, but above 0. What are the odds here that this is a soft landing?
Well, I'm not an odds person. People who know me know I don't like to gamble because I hate to lose money. But I will tell you, this is something that is going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. There will likely be some job losses. But I think if you look over the historical history here and our economic experiences, there's a really good chance that if we have job losses, it's going to be smaller than what we've seen in other situations. And that's what I'm banking on. You know, I talk to business leaders and people in communities across the Southeast. They are concerned, but they do still feel that there's a way to get to 2% in terms of inflation that will still leave them in a good place and leave our economy in a place where it is poised to grow and be resilient.
So you're still sticking with 2%?
That's our target. We haven't changed my view. I haven't changed my view on that. And I'm going to keep working to make sure that inflation starts to move in that direction as soon as possible.
So at the beginning of June, Jamie Dimon, who is the CEO of JP Morgan, predicted an economic hurricane. This week he was before Congress, and he said some of the challenges facing the U.S. are persistent inflation, shocks from Russia's war in Ukraine, and rising oil prices. You can't control some of those things. Are we in the eye of this storm? Is this the hurricane?
So I don't know if it's a hurricane. Look, there are lots of things that have happened over the last several months that really have been unexpected and have made our job more difficult. You know, the war in Ukraine definitely disrupted supply chains and I think set us back in terms of our recovery by many months. And so that's real. But there are also some positive things happening. You know, just last week, we averted the rail strike. I think that was a very positive thing. And we are still hearing, as I talk to businesses, that they are not expecting that they're going to have to lay off people very soon. And so we have momentum, and we should not lose sight of that as we start to see demand come down and us get inflation under control.
So tell me about that, because you look at the American South. We just did this CBS News polling to get political views, and we're seeing people in the state of Georgia have a rosier view of the economy than people nationwide. So 55% of Georgia voters describe the economy to us as good. Nationwide, only 28% say that. So that's perception. What's reality and what's happening in the South that's not reflected in the rest of the country?
Well, I can't speak for the rest of the country. What I will tell you is here in Atlanta, there's still considerable job growth. Businesses are saying that they are seeing a lot of economic potential. And that is shaping, I believe, the willingness to invest in the future. My expectation is that as we move along and we start to get inflation more under control, that viewpoint will become more generalized across the country. And people will be able to look over longer horizons and see that there's potential out there. So, you know, I understand we've got a lot of uncertainty now. The situation in Russia that you spent the first part of this show on has got everyone on edge. But we do know that some bottlenecks are starting to ease. And I'm hopeful that over the next several months, we'll start to see that gap between the high demand and that lower supply narrow significantly, which will then translate into inflation moving closer to our target.
You have job growth, you said, in the South. Do you have enough workers?
Well, we do have the challenge of a tight labor force. Everyone I talk to says, look, it's harder to find workers than it was 2 years ago.
Is the solution
But
immigration?
Our businesses are well, immigration could contribute to that. But what I would say is our business leaders have said it's not as hard today as it was a month ago. So they are starting to see those challenges ease up. But look, we have lots of complexity in our labor market. We know inflation is down. We know that families have done a lot of rethinking about whether they need two earners or whether they should keep someone home and not. We have challenges in terms of childcare. There's a lot of churn in our labor markets that we are going to have to monitor. And I'm grateful. My team, we've been doing a lot of good research on this, and we've identified some places to focus on that will give us a good clue as to the extent to which labor markets are easing.
We'll be watching for that. Thank you for your time today. We'll be back in a moment. We turn now to January 6th and the congressional investigation into the attack on the Capitol. Joining us is California Democratic Congressman Pete Aguilar, who is on that committee and joins us from Los Angeles. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Margaret.
We had a poll, as you may have heard out, that shows 1/3 of Republicans and half of self-described MAGA Republicans think that the party should plan to challenge states and districts that Democrats win. This is in November. 17% of Democrats feel they should challenge if the GOP wins. What does that say to you about trust in elections and the risk of political violence like we saw on January 6th?
It tells me that we have more work to do, but it's deeply alarming that we had a former occupant of the White House who, anytime a result went a different way than he wanted, called it fake news. And he sought to undermine our democratic institutions time and time again. So it's not much of a surprise that some of that has seeped into the American public. But our job is to make sure that we protect democracy and do everything we can to prevent that from happening.
So you have this first public hearing since July. It'll be this Wednesday. Politico is reporting that Vice President Mike Pence's activities are a focus of that hearing. Last night at a festival in Texas, Congresswoman Cheney said that the committee is still in discussions with Mike Pence's counsel, but she's optimistic he has an obligation to appear. Where do you fall on that? Do you need to subpoena him, or is that written testimony that you'd accept?
Well, I think it's important that we hear from the vice president, but the committee's work continues. We haven't made a determination on where we go with the vice president specifically. Those continue to be evolving discussions, and if there is something to announce, I'm sure the chairman will announce that. But I think what's more important is this hearing that we have coming up on Wednesday will be a continuation of what we heard in June and July, which was that the president played a direct role in trying to undermine our democratic institutions and prevent a peaceful transfer of power.
So the focus is not specifically on the vice president?
I'm not going to get into the content of the hearing that we'll have on Wednesday,
okay.
But I think it's fair to say that that the vice president's role, the pressure that the vice president faced, that was the hearing that I led in June. That was a key focal point of the committee's work. There are new details that we have learned broadly about the investigation, and we plan to share some of those this week.
To that point, Congresswoman Cheney said there are 800,000 pieces of communication the committee has received from the Secret Service. What is in those documents? How material is it?
Well, we appreciate that we have finally started to get the documents that we asked for a year ago from the United States Secret Service. These are still not the text messages that were discussed before, but these seem to be communications internally amongst staff members. So there's a lot of information that our investigative team has been going through. We won't detail all of it on Wednesday, but it's important that they are providing the information and that it continues to help in our investigative work understand what exactly was happening on January 5th and January 6th as this rally was happening and as the president was directing the mob to go to the Capitol.
So the lead Secret Service officer on the then president's detail, Tony Ornato, has been in question. He retired over the summer. Can you speak to him now?
Well, that's a conversation for him and his attorney. We remain deeply wanting to hear from him. The Secret Service indicated that they would make him available prior to his retirement, and then he coincidentally went out and retired. So we feel that it's important. He has spoken to us, but obviously we've heard new details since his testimony that we feel are important to ask. So he and others remain an important part of our investigative work that continues.
Do you mean to suggest that he retired so he wouldn't have to testify?
I'm just saying that the timeline is the timeline. We were in conversations to hear from him, and then he retired. So, as a private citizen, we will continue to work with his private attorney to see if he will come before the committee and share additional testimony with us.
So you mentioned at the top how critical the committee's work is, and critics have pointed to the fact that you took a break over the summer as a counterpoint to that, saying it couldn't be that immediate if you went away for 6 weeks. How do you respond to that?
Well, I can assure you that, and anyone looking at the calendar for the 9 of us on the select committee would know that we didn't go away. The investigative team continued their work. They continued looking through the documents that you referenced earlier. We continued to investigate, take depositions and testimony from key witnesses. All of those happened. They just happened out of public view. So we look forward to continuing this discussion over 20 hours of hearings that we have had so far. We look forward to the hearing this week. But ultimately, this is about protecting our democracy. And the final report in the future will have the committee's stamp of what we do next and what happened, where we go from here, and how precious democracy is and that it's worth fighting for.
Congressman Aguilar, we'll be watching this week. Thank you for your time today. Our CBS News coverage of the January 6th investigation hearing starts at 1 p.m. Eastern. You can see it on our broadcast or streaming network on Wednesday. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Since we ran out of time in our interview, Jake Sullivan did want to clarify that when it comes to Iran, the Biden administration still believes in nuclear diplomacy, but is not close to a deal at this point. And we will see how things unfold. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.